Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Hinrich Foundation webinar series on sustainable global trade. This one is being co-convened by the University of Adelaide's Institute for International Trade, and the IIT was really behind a new report that is really a meticulous exploration of the impact of domestic support for agriculture on climate, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the environment in terms of degradation of water, biodiversity, and land. This report is quite a valuable run-through of all the resources that are out there, for example, from agencies like WTO and OECD, on the impact of such support. And it comes to a few really important conclusions. One is that domestic support for agriculture remains high, and the other is that there's really very little constraint these days on governments that are providing this sort of support. One very striking thing that this report uncovers is that some 80 to 90% of the world's agricultural subsidies are concentrated in just 10 economies. And that makes it sound like it's going to be an easy problem to solve, but the reality, as this report tells you, is that it's not. So with me here today to explain some of these findings is the paper's co-author, Ken Ash. Ken Ash is a visiting fellow at the IIT, and he's also director of Ash Global Insights and the former director of Trade and Agriculture at OECD. Ken rides a really long career at the OECD. He's touched on pretty much every aspect of trade and food and agriculture and fisheries, more than 20 years at OECD. And prior to that, 20 years at the Canada policy agencies of agriculture and agri-food. And with him today as a co-panelist is just as illustrious a name in global trade policy, Deborah Elms, who is founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center. That sounds like a fairly innocuous sounding agency, but it advises governments and businesses to create better trade policy. And Debbie also is vice chair of the Asia Business Trade Association. She's an advisor to the Global Trade Professionals Alliance. She is a co-chair of the Trade Policy Committee. She holds a fellowship in the Singapore Trade Ministry's Trade Academy. She's had positions in government-linked trade negotiation and international political economy studies. So she is a well-known name in trade policy circles, and we're very glad to have her here. And with us today also is a really influential voice in global trade policy, Peter Draper. Peter is the executive director of the IIT, and he holds the University of Adelaide's chair in trade and environment. And he is also the deputy dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business, Law, and Economics at the University of Adelaide. And the University of Adelaide, by the way, produces a disproportionately high number of policymakers for Australia. For some reason I've never worked out, but it's a huge mint of policy thinkers. Peter also, sits on an almost absurd number of very influential bodies globally, including Australian Services Roundtable, South Australia Committee of the Australia-India Chamber of Commerce. He's a trustee at the International Chamber of Commerce, the European Center for International Political Economy, German Development Institute. I could go on. And he also has an honorary doctorate from Germany. He's held positions in South Africa. I'm starting to lose count of the number of continents that Peter has a direct policy influence on. And Peter is now going to tell us a little bit about the genesis of this report and the backing that it got. Peter.
Famous words of the online age, please unmute. So I've now unmuted. Yes, thanks very much for that generous introduction, Chinwe, and also thanks to the Foundation for hosting the online launch of our paper today. We've been anticipating this for some time, so it's really good to see it come to fruition. I'll be very brief. What I wanted to do was quickly talk a bit about the genesis of the report, so why this topic in particular. And I think the clue partly lies in Ken's own background, which is that for decades, really, not just economists, but many policy reformists have been trying to reform agricultural subsidies by making all the correct economic arguments in favor of them. But really, since the Uruguay round, there has been no evident reform, besides some small progress on export subsidies, not to be diminished, but the big boxes, so to speak, have not been reformed basically since the Uruguay round. So that's a problem in the international trading system. It's a problem that needs to be fixed, but the political economy of fixing it is very fraught indeed, and particularly in our current subsidies-rich environment. Now, on top of that, the planet faces the existential crisis of global warming. And in that context, to continue to be paying agricultural subsidies in ways that harm the environment or potentially harm the environment strikes me and us as a double sin, so to speak. Now, those are the two broad motivations behind the construction of this report. I acknowledge the generous funding of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who funded this particular report. I should also add, by the way, and Ken will go into this detail, I'm sure, that not all agricultural subsidies are harmful. And so there's a very interesting debate opening up around potential repurposing of some agricultural subsidies towards positive environmental impacts. And there's no one better, I think, than Ken to take us through this topic. I shall perhaps finally just acknowledge Anthony Cox, who's Ken's co-author, also worked at the OECD and made a very substantive contribution to this report as well. Thank you.
Right. I've talked to Ken, to Anthony Cox as well, and he's a senior policy advisor at the Ecologic Institute of Berlin. He's a great guy, very personable, and yes, a co-author of this report with Ken. So Ken, you've done a review of the literature, and as Peter alluded to, I mean, it's a very timely report because it comes off of COP27, and it addresses a very difficult environment. So you've run through the literature out there. What did you learn?
Okay, thank you for all of the introductions, including the shout out for Anthony. This was very much a collaborative effort, including with colleagues in Adelaide who did some of the number crunching for us. Look, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to address your question. I want to highlight just a few of the facts, some of the realities, so what we know about two things, the nature and the extent of agricultural support today, and to talk a little bit about the pathways through which this agricultural support impacts the environment. And as Peter has said, a priori, it's an open question as to whether it impacts it at all, positively or negatively. But when you look at the evidence, there's a relatively clear conclusion, which I'll share with you in a moment. I want to wrap up by moving from the available literature to some of our own thoughts on a way forward and alternative approach to agricultural support. But first, we know an awful lot today already about agricultural support, both from the WTO and the OECD. Now, the WTO data are based entirely on notifications by its members. Those data are organized according to the domestic support commitments that countries made back at the time of the Uruguay Round agreement. And the aim of these data are to inject a little transparency and to enable countries to monitor their respective compliance with commitments. Now, importantly, the commitments distinguish between support that clearly distorts production and trade. That support is to be available, but with limits, and minimally or non-trade distorting support. So as Peter has pointed out, there's nothing bad about government support. It is intended to do good things, but it doesn't always. And what negotiators agreed in 1995 was that there are forms of good support that ought to be in fact encouraged, certainly enabled, not prohibited, but there's also negative support that should be constrained. Now, the most distorting forms of support, it's been agreed and it's been demonstrated analytically, and the literature is very clear. The most distorting forms of support tend to be subsidies that are based on input use, so subsidies for fertilizer, pesticides, even water, and support that is based upon output quantities. So if you produce X, Y, or Z, then you receive a payment from the government. As well, there are less transparent regulatory measures that support domestic prices at levels that are higher than international prices. And you can do this through domestically administered prices underpinned by border controls. On the other side of the equation, support that is not directly linked to farm production decisions, support that provides services for the sector or for consumers overall, is generally considered to be least or minimally or non-trade distorting. So some of the facts. In 2016, which is the latest year that comprehensive WTO data are available, the most trade distorting forms of support totaled over $80 billion US. An additional more than 40 billion was provided for somewhat less distorting, but still distorting support associated with a range of development goals, direct payments with production limits, and so on. At the same time, minimally or non-trade distorting support applications 400 billion US. Now, you've made the point already that there is little constraint today to agricultural support increasing further. Minimally trade distorting support can be provided without limits. Permissible limits on trade distorting support today is $1 trillion US. Now, actual support is about 100 billion. What's possible while still being compliant with WTO rules is 1 trillion, expected to double to 2 trillion by 2030. Now, the point I'm trying to make over and over again here is that there is little constraint and there is room for even the high levels of trade distorting support today to increase further. Two final points, and you've made one of them. Over 80% of the support that is provided comes from just 10 of the WTO's 164 members. And I don't have time to go into detail, but there's also a very high variation in support levels across commodities. Looking at the OECD data very briefly, the OECD covers 54 countries, but 75% of the global agricultural value added. The data are not organized according to negotiations and commitments. They're organized according to an economic framework that's intended to allow analysis of both the incidence and the likely impact of actual policies that are in place. Now, the OECD estimates are available up until last year and for the last 25 years. They reveal increasing levels of support recently for a variety of reasons. Over the 3-year period ending in 2021, on average, every year, 611 billion US were transferred to producers. And over 60% of that support was delivered via the most most production and trade distorting policy instruments. So there's a great deal of information available, much more in fact than I just talked about. There's also a growing body of research looking at how agricultural subsidies impact not just production and trade, but the environment. Production-linked support at high levels essentially changes the economic incentives of farmers and it's been shown often lead to unintended negative environmental outcomes. Now, there's pretty widespread agreement in the literature on the causal pathways. They refer to them as the intensive margin, the extensive margin, and the exit-entry margin. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Input and output subsidies encourage, obviously, the increased use of more inputs, like fertilizers, like pesticides, and more intensive stocking rates and more intensive cropping practices, which can lead, for example, to overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, increased runoff, and higher greenhouse gas and other emissions. Production and price support encourages extensification of production systems and changes in land use, and can bring fragile land, for example, or pasture back into crop production, endangering both carbon sinks, biodiversity, and so on. And all forms of production-linked support encourage bringing new land into production, again, decreasing carbon sinks and natural habitats, potentially increasing deforestation and soil erosion, and so on. So these are illustrations of the kinds of unintended impacts that much of the existing support package have. Now, again, I think Peter has touched on this. Agricultural support can also have positive impacts on the environment, for example, by targeting the provision of habitats, by targeting increased carbon storage, and so on. But the facts are that over the past 3 years, on average, less than $10 billion targeted the provision of these environmental public goods, in contrast to the hundreds of billions of dollars of production-linked support that have been provided. Now, two major reports on the effects of agricultural support amongst the many studies that are out there focused on greenhouse gas emissions. I just want to call them out. In 2021, there was a report released by the FAO, the UNDP, and UNEP. And earlier this year, a report by the World Bank Group looking at, as I say, the effects of agricultural support on emissions. Both studies were underpinned by model-based analysis undertaken by the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. It's based in Washington, but it has global operations. Both of these reports simulated the impact of removing all agricultural subsidies and border measures. Now, the details differ a little, but both studies found that global greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. There's significant variations across countries, but very clear reductions in emissions when existing subsidies and border measures are removed. The 2022 report, the more recent report by the bank, also included an illustrative scenario whereby the financial savings from support reductions are repurposed, as Peter has suggested, to innovation measures, to investment in research and development, science and technology, for example, and those investments in turn drive very substantial further greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the impacts of agricultural support on land, water, and biodiversity. They're much more local in nature. There's lots of research. We restricted ourselves in our report primarily to global level analysis. And here I just want to mention one thing with respect to these wider environmental impacts, that much of the literature focuses on strategies for removal or reform of environmentally harmful subsidies. So finally, what does all this mean? Okay, we know that agricultural support is high. We know it's increasing. We know it's highly concentrated in a few countries and across relatively few commodities. And we know that much of this support relies on policy instruments that distort production and trade and are environmentally harmful. Not all subsidies, but much of what exists today. And we know that multilateral trade rules are becoming less binding. So we have a couple of suggestions. The first is to make the available information and analysis more accessible, more penetrable to policymakers. There's a lot of information, but it's not always as well understood, and it's certainly not as well used as it might be. But at the same time, I think there are strategically important knowledge gaps. And I just want to highlight two very quickly. The first, I think we can look more closely at the policy options and the agribusiness strategies that are available to less developed economies. Here, the challenge is not to remove excessive levels of support, it's to invest more in agriculture, in developing country agriculture, in reducing the productivity gap, in ensuring better environmental outcomes than we've seen in some developed economies. So it's to find those good forms of subsidies, those good forms of support that would serve agriculture in less developed economies well. The second area is we focus a lot on CO2 emissions, but in agriculture, the impacts of support on methane and nitrous oxide emissions are important as well. And this is an area where Anthony, my co-author, has pointed out we could do a much better job. The second area that we are suggesting warrants more attention is even when you have all this information, it is not, again, it's not being understood well. And we think it's important to bring the available evidence, the available facts together with multiple and diverse stakeholders. Okay, it's no longer, it's not good enough for experts to talk to experts. We need to bring together international organizations, yes, the academic community, yes, but also civil society organizations that focus not just on agriculture or on trade, but focus as well on environment, science and technology, development, and so on, with the industry, with businesses and farmers. And we think we need a network, a coalition to increase the coherence of messages that go to policymakers. Like there's a lot of information, but there's a lot of noise. And if you're a policy maker or a policy advisor, hearing all of this noise, who do you believe? Which information is quote unquote right? So I think we can do a better job as analysts and as advisors to cut through that noise and be a little more coherent in the messaging. On that basis, it's important to work together to target key existing international venues, so APEC, G20, G7, and so on. But also, I think we have to be much more open. What we've tried in the last 27 years has not worked all that well. We need to find new ways forward to reform agricultural policy. So there's an interesting initiative at the WTO, the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. We think that offers quite some potential. Why not think a little harder about not a multilateral, but a plurilateral agreement on agriculture, for example? It seems to me that might be a possibility. Another area, subsidies are probably the only growing industry in the world today. Maybe a conversation around comprehensive subsidy reform. So not just focusing on agriculture, but agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, industrials, semiconductors, and so on. So is there some possibility to reach the trade-offs that negotiators need across countries by looking more comprehensively than one single sector? The final point I want to make is we don't often pay attention sufficiently to the enormous opportunity costs of existing subsidies. So within agriculture, for example, production-based income transfers to farmers means that there is less money available for investment in research and development, agricultural education, extension services, application of digital to agriculture. So there's alternative uses for the money, and if you spend it on X, you can't spend it on Y. Same thing applies more broadly across the economy. So money spent on agriculture is money that's not available for hospital beds and medical services, for schools, for teachers, and so on. So our point is we think we can do better. And again, I want to end on this. It's not about eliminating agricultural support because somehow that is by definition bad. It's not. It's about ensuring that the support that is provided works as it is intended to work. Right. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And absolutely unarguable conclusions that you come to improving accessibility of information, as well as focusing the messaging it's also important, I guess, to understand the why and how did we get here question. And as you point out, I mean, the trade support available these days to governments have virtually no limits. And I think you mentioned something like 60% of 600 billion a year is diverted to distorting or potentially distorting subsidies, and that's about 400 billion, and it's a 400 billion essentially free spending amount to, as you say, amplify the deleterious effects of poorly governed agriculture. And Debbie has a lot of experience, you know, understanding how governments got to this place where trade support can be virtually, you know, can virtually come without any limits. Debbie, do you have any thoughts to share on this?
I thought you were going to say that somehow I did this. Let me just be clear. I didn't do it. It was not me.
I think,
so how did we end up with, I mean, so I think what makes this paper really useful actually is Ken and Anthony's backgrounds, which are unique, right? It's very hard to find someone who can take these sort of big, overarching, complicated problems in multiple spheres and then pull them together to make a coherent narrative. So when he talks about a lack of transparency, I think it's really, it's not, maybe we have some lack of transparency, but it's much more an ability to maneuver between different pockets of information and pull them together to make a coherent narrative. So here you're talking about subsidies and the rules about subsidies and how subsidies work. Trade, partly because these are subsidies in trade areas, they have trade implications, they have trade consequences. And that's a venue that we have had for handling some of these issues around subsidies. We don't have a lot of places to talk about subsidies. And environment and the challenges caused by the environment. So these are sort of three enormous buckets of information that all have to be pulled together and made into a coherent story. And I think what's been missing is that weaving together of the narrative. So we sometimes talk subsidies. In fact, now we're talking more subsidies than ever because we see them in so many venues. We talk about trade distortion in other areas. Sometimes agriculture doesn't have to be agriculture, but just generally the distortion in trade, we talk about that. And then we, of course, talk about environmental damage, but it's hard to pull them all three together. So I think part of how we've gotten here is that we don't always have the visibility on those three, at least those three areas and how they connect. So you could be focusing on just a piece of the problem or a piece of the issue, and you don't recognize necessarily how it all adds together. So, you know, potentially subsidies are a problem for so many reasons. They could create trade distorting issues. We know that. And we know that you end up with sometimes bad environmental outcomes, but sort of tracking it back and saying, well, these environmental outcomes in part, not in whole, but in part are at least exacerbated, if not driven by the trade distorting subsidies, right? So that sort of just stringing the pieces together makes it hard to address it, I think. So that's the first reason why do we have this mess? Hard to see those sort of big picture changes in different avenues and different venues. The second reason I would argue, of course, I come at this from sort of political economy, is that there are some good reasons from a domestic political economy point of view for how we started down the subsidy path in the first place. We have powerfully entrenched political interests, particularly around big agricultural producers of certain commodities, who in some jurisdictions have done a great job of receiving subsidies. Those subsidies then could do lots of things. Again, not all subsidies are bad, but they get those subsidies in certain ways. And then that sort of builds in an entrenched like path, right? It's hard to get out of that. So we've had, as you've heard earlier today, you know, decades of discussions about how do we undo this. We've tried formulas, we've tried negotiation, we've tried lots of things. Ultimately, it's tough to do. And then, you know, when you take that problem and you add it to the entrenched challenges of the trading system, which, first of all, has got built-in challenges attached to the increase of allowable subsidies and the kinds of subsidies. We never really had a very good handle on subsidies to begin with, and now it's gotten even worse, and the trade system is breaking down, at least if we don't have it collapsing. Challenges there, and then of course the environment. So I think, why haven't we fixed this? Because all of these areas have challenges themselves. And again, if you're trying to deal with a very large, holistic type of problem that has entrenched interests behind it now in all of these venues, it's not a surprise that it's challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a question for Ken, but I actually wanted to divert to a question based on something that on what you said that jumped out at me, Debbie. You said that there isn't a good place now to talk about these things, and I assume you mean that there's a lack of a good multilateral forum left to air these things out. I mean, is that what you mean? And if so, why is that? What happened?
Well, I mean, subsidies have always been hard to address. They're just hard to address. And they require, among other things, trade-offs, right? We have to be able to have a compromise at the end between those who are going to lose out on subsidies and those who could get some other benefit, and you have to be able to trade them off. The number of venues that we have globally for managing that kind of big payoff, trade-off kind of a thing is limited. You know, in the past, we've always had the GATT WTO system, the trading system, which has some of that ability when it's working, but we haven't had an agreement since 1995.
Yeah, exactly. So
this is hard. Like, how do we get an agreement?
Yeah.
In that setting? And if we don't do it in that setting, where else do we do that? So lots of people have proposed things like, you know, you could use the OECD, which is, again, Ken's got a great background, tried very hard, but it doesn't include everybody. And the trade-offs are hard, right? Like, what am I getting? If I give this up, what do I get in return? That trade-off is very hard in the OECD context. So then you say, well, maybe G20, G7, but you have a diverse group of countries in there, but they're not diverse enough in a way. And again, the trade-off is missing. What am I getting if I in exchange for this?
Yeah.
So if you do it in a climate or environment or ag setting, which we have some of those, right? I mean, we have the COP process, we have food and agriculture forums and so forth. Again, you need a big enough tent to be able to create win-win outcomes. And that has been a challenge, especially for this complicated nexus of agriculture, subsidies, trade, and environment.
Right. And just very, very quickly, because I want to get back to Ken, but just very quickly, agricultural subsidies at the WTO has been a notable failure, even while progress was being made on other fronts quite substantially. I mean, is there any particular reason that you think that's the case? I mean, you talked a little bit about entrenched in interest. I guess that's partly to do with it. Anything else? So,
well, I think agriculture is always difficult because I think it's sensitive everywhere. I mean, even in Singapore, that doesn't hardly produce it, or has never up until now produced much, is still sensitive on agriculture. The few things they do make, they care a lot about. You know, for a long time, they were very protectionist on orchids, for example, you know, because that's what they did produce. So, you know, even little places that don't produce any agriculture tend to be defensive and protectionist on agriculture.
right.
So, and you have, again, sort of historically entrenched actors. They tend to be rural areas, depending on how you structure your domestic political structure. Often we overrepresent rural interests in our political systems. And there are concentrated benefits, especially from subsidies, right? You know when you get one. And
Right.
the rest of us who are disadvantaged by a subsidy, we're disadvantaged, but only a tiny piece. Like, I'm not going to go out and protest in the streets because some farmer got a lot of money. Like, that's just not gonna, that's not gonna work for me. So
Right.
you have very concentrated and intense recipients against a very diffuse group of individuals or businesses that are harmed by this. And so that doesn't balance.
Yeah.
And the net result is it can be very hard to reform agriculture in general. And then agriculture times, in this case, now we're at 164 members of the WTO. So 164 different political economy structures,
Right.
dealing with very sensitive issues. You know, you can see why you end up with gridlock. So
Right.
even if we all say, yeah, this is something that needs to be dealt with, and papers like Ken's, I think, is great because it reminds you of the actual cost, both in money and in environment.
Yeah.
still difficult to get everybody to go, well, yeah, because it's always like someone else's problem, right? I want you to fix it. I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing, but you deal with this, you fix it in your area and I'll be fine.
Right, absolutely. And it's a good juncture, I think, to segue to Ken, because you talked about the domestic support for agriculture and how, people who get the subsidies, they know that they're getting it and they're very keen to cling on to it. And the people who aren't as willing to do something about it. And Ken, your report talks a little bit about exactly this level of domestic support. Why is domestic support such a force to be reckoned with when it comes to agriculture?
I think Deborah has given us a very large part of the response to that question. Look, and I agree with everything she said. She said it more clearly than I could. The facetious answer is, we need to define the distinction between a good and a bad subsidy, okay? And so if you ask me, well, a good subsidy are my subsidies and a bad subsidies are your subsidies. And, that's very facetious, but unfortunately, there's a certain amount of truth in that. And I think that's why, the point that Deborah's making around that the narrative matters more than the individual factoids. So bringing together the whole story, bringing together the diverse and the disparate interests. I mean, this is not just about production agriculture. This is about climate. This is about environment. This is about the distribution of those subsidies. Who benefits?
Right.
Well, the beneficiary of most existing subsidies are big farmers producing certain crops in certain countries. And what about everybody else? So the distributional aspect of this is another part of the story that's undertold. But it's our sense that if support to agriculture is going to be reformed, it's going to require a recognition and an agreement amongst the various special interests. And I don't mean the beneficiaries, the recipients. I mean people that are concerned about the environment, that are concerned about development, that are concerned about innovation and a more circular economy. Those folks need to come together. And if you're making the decision and you've got 122 people telling you different things with different facts, it's easy to do nothing. Or it's easy to carry on business as usual. And I think that model has to be broken. We need to be a little more sort of together when we message around this. So I think that's super important. It's a crowded space, more heat than light, as the expression goes, and trying to cut through that is important. And we spent a lot of time sort of doing some version of this at the conceptual level. So, we're at 10,000 meters, and I think we need to get down to 10 meters and start using more granular information, start bringing forward these very important trade-offs that Deborah has talked about. So a production subsidy to agriculture is intended to increase production. And when they were introduced 30 or 40 years ago, that was the principal objective. Mm-hmm. Today, the principal objective is more complicated. Yes, you need to grow production, but you need to do it without using more land, because if you do use more land, you increase emissions. You need to do it while enabling livelihood opportunities in those countries that rely in particular on agriculture for their growth and development. You need production subsidies. I mean, if you think about this for like a nanosecond, a subsidy to produce something is generally targeted to a particular crop. Okay? And so if you subsidize wheat and rice, you are by definition discouraging the production of fruit and vegetables. So in a number of countries, you're actually having negative impacts, not just on the environment, but on health. Or at least food availability within a certain range. So my point is that these trade-offs matter, and until they get made better by the people giving advice, as opposed to, here's my specialized advice, now you as a policy guy, you sort it out. then I think we're going to be stuck in the same situation.
Right. And in a way, your answer, touches on a question that I was going to ask Debbie, which is what is the problem with subsidies? And actually, Ken, you've talked about some of the unintended consequences that come from this. But Debbie, what do you think? What would you say is the nub of the problem with subsidies? We've talked about this a little bit in our chat prior. Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, there's a few of them. I think one big one for me is that they never go away.
Right.
So if you look in the United States as an example, the United States pays something like, I haven't seen the recent numbers, but something like 7 times the world price for sugar. And you say to yourself, this is crazy. Why is the United States doing that? Because of 1940. In World War II, the United States wanted to ensure that it had domestic production of sugar to make cakes during World War II, cakes and biscuits and whatever. So they started subsidizing, and those subsidies are still there.
Right.
They're still there after all these decades,
Yeah.
I mean, because now you have a very entrenched group of folks, especially in the case of sugar, incredibly entrenched. And it's so bad that literally officials who could do something about this will tell you, I'm sorry, I'm not even allowed to utter the word sugar. I can't, as long as I stay in government, I can't use the word. I can only talk about it after I've retired, and then I will tell you what a nightmare it is to deal with sugar. But while I'm in office, I can't,
That's it.
I can't deal with it. And so this is one of the challenges of subsidies. They get in, they become very entrenched. They're really hard to get rid of. And they have these unintended consequences. I mean, let me just describe to you how stupid this is. And it's similar to Ken's story, but similar. So on the sugar, because sugar is so expensive in the States, what do? You find alternative sources of sweeteners. What are those alternative sources? One of them is corn syrup. So we make sugar out of corn. Corn syrup, as it turns out, is much worse for you than sugar. So as a result of that, you end up with incredible amounts of corn syrup being used across the US food production,
Right.
which does what? It fattens up Americans. Now you've got an obesity crisis, and the obesity crisis creates a whole host of health issues, diabetes and, all kinds of problems.
Right.
So you say to yourself, like, how ridiculous could this policy be? You started to make cake in 1942 or whatever, and now you have created a health crisis, and you still can't fix it. So it shows, I think, that what started with good intentions, to be fair. I mean, I wasn't there in 1940, so I don't know what the thought was when they said, let's subsidize sugar for cake.
Right.
But there must have been some idea that was like, let's do this because it's important.
Right.
And yet the long-term consequences of that have been catastrophic.
Right.
And so I think for me, when you say what is wrong with subsidies, I always think about sugar in the States. I mean, we could do it with 1,000 other things. Footwear, why does the United States have crazy footwear? Same thing. Like all kinds of weird policies came from subsidies that started in the 40s that can't get rid of. But that's the sort of story you get over and over and over again. So again, It's not necessarily that subsidies were started for bad reasons. It's not necessarily that they're all bad. I mean, I could subsidize, depending on how we define this, education as an example. And I would say, actually, that's great. Educational subsidies, let's get kids educated. Like that's a subsidy that we could get behind. But then there are subsidies that start for the best of intentions that create distortions. And then you end up with this like horrible system 100 years later. And here we are. So I think for me, what's wrong with subsidies is the long-term nature, the unintended consequences, the buildup of momentum to keep them in place long after they serve their purpose. You just can't wean people off subsidies very easily. And so the net result of all of that is we get bad outcomes. So, it'd be nice if we didn't start the subsidies. And let me just finish on a slightly also depressing note. As we come out of COVID, one of the things that's happened under the COVID period is that governments that are able to do so have been subsidizing like crazy. And again, we can argue, we could certainly say for very good reasons, because you wanted people to survive, you wanted them to have food, you wanted them to have income. You locked them in their houses, they had to have some kind of way to survive. Very good intentions. I would bet that if we had this seminar 100 years from now, we will look back and we will say, this bad policy started with a COVID subsidy in 2020 and we're still dealing with the consequences.
Right. Absolutely. Your point is that subsidies become a living thing on its own. It grows on its own, and you can barely control it after a while. And it's an excellent point that you made about sugar in the US, because for some reason, sugar in Asia occupies a similar space. I mean, it just took over. I mean, sugar interest, so to speak. And the impact, the sort of downstream impact in terms of healthcare, life expectancy. We recently at the Hinrich Foundation launched a Sustainable Trade Index, and we worked life expectancy and healthcare into our indicators precisely because of these considerations, that downstream of these policies that we have in trade, in agriculture, it does impact our individual health. So absolutely on point. I wanted to pivot back a little bit to a point that Ken talked about in his preamble, which is about the repurposing of subsidies. And I think in your paper, Ken, with Anthony, you talked a little bit about some scenarios in terms of restructuring domestic support and conditionality and repurposing of green innovation. I think these were takeaways that you took from the FAO and UNDP and UNEP reports. So repurposing, I mean, is it a good thing? Is it not a good thing? We sort of get the sense already from your preamble, but do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So would it surprise you if I said it depends?
Yeah, well, not really, but
look, the term repurposing, it's relatively recent, but I'm not sure what it means all the time. I know what it means in the two studies I talked about because they define it very clearly, but I've heard repurposing used by many people to mean many different things. So whether it's repurposing or reforming or targeting or whatever you want to call it, an alternative approach to accomplish what governments say they want to accomplish, an alternative to the existing relatively inefficient approaches, support to agriculture, for example, with all of the unintended impacts that we talked about. So if what we mean by repurposing is one of three things, or maybe all three things. So rather than spend the money as we spend it today, we can give that money back to the taxpayer and let her decide, or let him decide what to do with his or her money. It's not going to happen, in part because of the many reasons that Deborah has elaborated. We can send the money back to the finance ministry and say, look, you have a fixed amount of money for a whole range of economic, social, environmental priorities, of which agriculture may be a big or a small element. So whether or not there's a subsidy for the production of sugar, or there's a subsidy to ensure the education system or the healthcare system is as functional as it should be, that's a decision that ought to be made, presumably at the center of government. Even within agriculture, if there's a desire for political or any other reasons to keep a level of support in agriculture, rather than spend it on policies that were introduced 30, 40 years ago, linked to producing commodities that were undersupplied 30 or 40 years ago, but are not undersupplied today, there are lots of good uses of money to drive research and development. The returns on agricultural R&D are enormous, but there's a very long time lag. So the private sector underspends. So there is a good use of public money to drive science and technology, to encourage a shift to a more circular economy, to allow digital opportunities, digital applications to be introduced more widely. But, and I want to be clear on this point as well, the current structure of agriculture is in part a function of long-standing subsidies. So if you pull them away today, you are going to have a big negative impact on lots of people who do what they do because they responded quite sensibly to the whole package of market and policy incentives that were in place. So I don't think it's a sensible proposition, socially, economically, politically, to go to zero tomorrow. But you can begin to move tomorrow. And as you move away from the current structure of support to something else, whether it's high or low levels of support, to think and to not just think, but to act, to enable those folks who had to make the transition to a different economic environment to do so. So in some cases, this will be helping farm families transition out of agriculture. In some cases, it's about making more economic opportunities, more sustainable production opportunities and marketing opportunities available to farm families. So my point is, you can use the money differently in many ways, and if that's what we mean by repurposing, then I think it's a good thing.
Right. So spending, if you're going to spend it more wisely is generally the sort of dictum. Debbie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do think it's, again, think about my sugar example. If you were to say tomorrow, no more subsidies for this, there would be, and I think that is a genuinely important point to note, there would be consequences, because you've got a lot of firms that are either in the corn sweetener space themselves, not in sugar, or they have formulated products and all kinds of things to fit corn syrup, corn sweeteners, which they might not do in the absence of those subsidies. And if you just shut it off tomorrow, you would have a problem. So I think it is a very good point that Ken is making, that it cannot be an overnight adjustment. But that doesn't mean that you don't start somewhere. I mean, you can't sort of say, every year you hear this from some folks who would say, oh, but we couldn't possibly, because if we did, we would have all these horrible consequences. You have to say, but every year we say that, we end up with horrible consequences. But they're just different horrible consequences. And so what we need to do is actually do something instead of endlessly discussing doing something. Start the process now and move towards something more coherent and crucially more sustainable in the longer run. Otherwise, we end up, especially in this agricultural subsidy problem, with very bad outcomes for trade and horrible outcomes often for the environment. So like, that is where we don't want to be. Can we figure out a way to start the process tomorrow rather than, another 25 years from now, we think about doing something, or will be too late?
Right. Absolutely. A question for Peter. Peter, we've talked, a lot about this in a global sense at quite a high altitude. Why does all this matter to the Asia Pacific, you think?
Thanks, Henrich. Yeah, it's been fascinating listening to Ken and Deborah elaborate on this theme. I could listen all day. To bring it back to our region, so I flew in this morning actually from Cambodia. Cambodia is a least developed country, as those who know the region would know well. It's on a graduation trajectory, but it's still a least developed country. One of its most important export products is rice. And it produces very high quality rice. I was given a packet of jasmine rice to take back with me. I managed to smuggle it through Australian customs. I'll confess that online. I did declare it, so don't worry, I got through customs. That's a different sensitivity, by the way. So Australia has a biosecurity sensitivity as opposed to keeping farmers on the land per se sensitivity. Right. Now, Cambodia and the Cambodian government, compared to, say, China, which is also a big rice producer, obviously, and pays an enormous amount of subsidies to its farmers, or in India, also in the Asia context, it cannot compete with the fiscus of those countries or any other big subsidizing country for that matter. So if you are a Southeast Asian LDC like Cambodia, wanting to get a leg up on the development ladder and compete with the big guys, the playing field is just not even for you. And that's before you encounter all the market access barriers that there are out there. So maybe one element of that repurposing debate, by the way, is to think about ways in which we can reallocate some of those subsidies to support LDCs like Cambodia to boost their rice production and get poor farmers on a virtuous development cycle and in a sustainable way. And I do want to bring us back to sustainability, because at the end of the day, we do have a climate emergency. And today we're talking agriculture subsidies and their impact on agriculture. But we shouldn't forget as well, and this is evidence of how difficult reform is in this space, that governments are paying enormous amounts of money on fossil fuel subsidies. So it's agriculture, it's fossil fuels, it's a range of other things, and it all needs to come into the mix in terms of reform options.
Right. And this brings us sort of full circle back to the point that we began with, which was that it was the high concentration of subsidies in a very, in a handful of nations in the world, and evening up the sort of playing field would go toward, in a sense, breaking up a market distortion, a global market distortion in the first place. But looking ahead, and we're bumping up against time, so I want to ask Ken to look ahead. And in your paper, Ken, you talked about coalition building and improving awareness. What do you think you'd like to see coming out of policymakers as they build on this report?
So going into policymaking first, I think, and Deborah made this point very clearly, the individual interests, the individual topics, many aspects are well known. What's missing is the narrative. It's the overall story that brings together the different forces at play. And I don't, going into the policy making process, I think it's incumbent on folks like us that provide advice to be more in the business of storytelling, of narrative development, based on evidence, based on facts. But these individual little factoids, it's not working. So pulling this together, I think, is super important. Coming out of the policy making process, what I'd like to see is, it's exactly the point that I tried to make, and I think Deborah made very clearly. Look, had we started to do some of the things we're talking about today back in 2000, when the Uruguay Round Agreement was signed in 1995, they said they would start negotiations to further reform agriculture 5 years on. Had we started in 2000, we'd be finished now. So you do need a transition period. You do need support for folks to get to a different operating environment, but you need to begin. And the sooner we begin, the sooner we'll end, and the sooner we'll end up in a better place. Final comment I want to make is to take this from information into the policy-making process, out of the policy-making process to the globe. So how do you do this multilaterally? And one option that has not yet been explored, I don't think, is to focus on subsidy reform, not on agricultural reform, on subsidy reform. So as you look at agriculture, fossil fuels, fisheries, industrials, because across, I mean, I do some work on aluminium, for example, big subsidies that essentially serve to increase output, and it's a very energy intensive sector, sometimes increase output beyond what the market wants, driving up emissions unnecessarily, but it also encourages production to shift from relatively low, relatively unsubsidized emissions production systems, so based on renewables and hydro, to production systems based on coal and fossil fuels, which have 10 times as greenhouse gas emitting as hydro. So it is a multi-sector reform that looks at the economics, but the environment and the social distributional consequences. We have to get to that, in my view, rather than the single issue, single sector approach that we've seen so much of recently.
Right, absolutely. Really interesting that you're ending with a call to arms for multilaterals. Debbie, any thoughts on that? You're the master of multilateral.
No, I was just going to say that I hope that the solution to leveling the playing field is not to subsidize more, but to cut the subsidies down, because my worry is that if we all subsidize and we all subsidize what we care about, we end up again with even more accelerated bad outcomes. So let's think about better ways to level the playing field that do not include additional subsidies by everybody, which is where I worry, particularly coming out of COVID, that we're headed. And, you know, again, 100 years from now, we'll be having this conversation all over again, and people will say, what were they thinking in 2020 when they started this whole train into motion?
Absolutely. And that's a wrap from us today at the Hinrich Foundation and the University of Adelaide's Institute for International Trade. Thank you for joining us. You'll see a QR code coming up on your screens right now. You can scan it to download all our materials. Thank you.